Welcome to Ken's Corner Podcast, Season 4.
Welcome back to Ken's Corner, and finally, I'm back with some wrestling content. It's been so long since last summer. I've been working with hockey for so long. It's great to be back. I'm with former professional wrestler and now wrestling podcaster, Casey Thompson. Casey, how are you doing? You're all the way down there in Florida. Thank you for joining me on Ken's Corner.
Oh no, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's definitely probably a not the weather's probably a lot nicer here than in Canada. So we just had a little cold front come through. It was like 42 last night, but it's like
Oh,
in the 70s right now. So, you know, it's not bad.
I think we're on par with you right now. This is one of our best days so far up here in Toronto, Canada. I think we had like a plus 14 or 15. So we're all out there in bathing
Ooh,
suits today, I'll tell you. Not really, but
wow.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
don't
what
miss
that,
those days at all.
yeah, we're in a different Fahrenheit and Celsius. So we're on a
Right,
different
right.
level there. But
Wow. Yeah, I
anyway,
don't miss those.
for sure. Let's walk us back through your career. Let's start
Okay.
with why you decided, like, what did young Casey see in professional wrestling that he wanted to be involved in it?
Well, it goes back and goes all the way up north to Michigan. Where I'm from. My parents in the 70s were really big wrestling fans. They used to go to the whole circuit from Detroit to Cobo Hall. I mean, you name it, they hit it, and that was in the Sheik's territory, which was big time championship wrestling. So, um, as we moved through, we ended up down in South Florida, Southeast Florida, in Fort Myers, Florida, and my parents were watching it was the Madison Square Garden network, and I was watching. I walked by and I was like, oh, this is garbage, and I just went to my room. And then a few weeks later they were watching, or I don't know if they were watching, it was just on the TV. It was championship wrestling from Florida, and Dusty Rhodes was talking. You had Dusty, Gordon Soley, Blackjack Mulligan, all those guys. And I heard Dusty on the mic just, doing his promo, and I was hooked. It was done. At that age, I was probably 10 years old. So,
That's amazing.
yeah, 10 years old, 10, 11 years old. And I was in love with it, and that's what I wanted to do. And I never waved from it. So as we grew, well, actually started there. We started watching the wrestling every Saturday at noon. You'd hear the music, and Gordon Soley's iconic voice would come on. And the same thing when he was leaving the show, he would say, "So long from the Sunshine State," And every time, the more and more I watched it, the more and more I wanted to do it. And then I remember going to our first um, live wrestling event. It was at the Lee County Civic Center. I can remember it like it was yesterday. The main event was Dusty Rhodes versus Abdullah the Butcher. You had for the Southern title Mike Rotunda against Angelo Mosco Sr. There you go, another Canadian.
Yes,
And then
from Hamilton, Ontario.
Cowboy Ron Bass versus Barry Windham for the Florida title. And then I think it was Mike Graham and Mike Davis versus the Zambui Express. And then you had a couple other matches in there. Um, so, and Fort Myers wasn't a weekly town, but it was like a monthly town. They were there every month. And so I'm the type of person that I always network anywhere I go. And so I started talking to the ring guy, which was an old wrestler. He was an old shooter, Gordon Nelson. So um, he actually let me start helping him set up and tear down the ring. So, which was cool because I got to go there early at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to set up, 3 o'clock, and I didn't have to pay to get in. And I would help set up the ring. And then it evolved from there to where during the matches, I would ring the bell sometimes. I would go get drinks for the wrestlers at the concession stand, hot dogs, or, take their merchandise up to the table, different things like that. And then it went to the guy who promoted the town was a former Olympian, wrestling Olympian named Coach John Heath. He was a really older guy, and he commentated one of the weekly programs too. And Coach used to send me posters to my house, and I used to poster the town for him. So I mean, 11 years old, that's when I really, I guess, say I got my feet wet because I really wasn't in the business. I just was helping out and stuff like that. So, and and I never veered from my wanting to be a wrestler. I mean, people heard it so much, they're like, yeah, sure, whatever, kid, sure, kid. So it got to the point where I'm in high school. We ended up moving to Central Florida in Orlando, and um, there happened to be a poster hanging in the school. My parents were teachers. There was a poster there that said, professional wrestling, had the whole card, and it happened to be across the street at the Central Florida Fairgrounds. And it also said on the bottom, become a professional wrestler. I was 15 years old.
Oh,
And you would think parents would be like, oh, no, no, no. My parents are very supportive behind the whole thing. So, 15 years old, of course, I wasn't old enough to drive. My dad had to drive me to there, to it. And I guess I was a bigger kid. I was about, 185, close to 200 pounds. So, in like 6 foot tall. So, um, yeah, they let me start training. That was my first training. I was trained by a guy that wrestled in no territories. He wrestled Florida. He did Memphis. He did Don Owens out in um, Portland in the that territory. So his name is the Golden Boy Jerry Gray. So he trained me, and Jerry has a bad rap, for ripping people off, this and that. I never experienced that against me. He always took care of me. He actually lived about 2 blocks from my house. So he would call me. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Nothing." He's like, "Want to work out?" And he had a ring in his backyard. And I'm like, "Yeah." So I'd get on my bike and I'd ride my bike over there. And we'd work out for hours at a time. So my dad drove me to all the training and I trained for 1 year before I had my first match. So that's how I got into the business, and my parents were very, very supportive of it, and it took me there and everything. So that's
oh,
that's how I got my start.
that's
Was in
amazing.
Orlando, Florida.
Thank you. So you went through all the grinds of the indies and stuff like that. Now
Oh yeah.
let's take us to the early 90s. You were in the heart of the WWF, WCW wrestling wars, I guess is so to speak. You had a friend who was a announcer at WWF and you performed at WCW. Let's talk about your times in the 90s and some of the memories you have from those days.
Yeah. So as everything evolved, I got broken into business. So I was married to a guy that, that's what you call it, married to him, because I wrestled him every single night. Old time legend Bugsy McGraw. Bugsy, I mean, he's been in the business for 50 years, five decades. Um, he sold out the Madison Square Garden with Bruno, San Martino. So, I mean, the guy's been around. He broke me in. He really helped me, taught me everything, taught me how to throw a forearm, taught me how to cut my head open with a razor blade. You name it, he was there to help me. He's 80 years old now, and smart as a tack. Remembers everything. Does he remembers more than I remember? Um, so he broke me in the business, and then I um, was fortunate enough to in the 90s. Blackjack Mulligan had a wrestling school, and I helped train it. I went there first just to work out, and then we got to know each other, get around. I ended up being his trainer for him. I trained all of his guys, and that's where I met my podcast partner Kevin Kelly, because Kevin was a announcer for IWF, which was Eddie Mansfield's promotion, and in the 90s at the original Soundstage 23 at Universal Studios. So he is a commentator. Jack asked me to do a favor. He's like, "Hey, can you wrestle to help out these guys, because they look, a lot of them look great. They just didn't have a lot of really good ability in the ring. Some were good, some were just the drizzling shits basically." And so I was like, "Oh man, I don't want to get heat," because I was wrestling. I was just started off at WCW then, and I remember hearing like Ric Flair and guys like this, some older guys that were I heard the rumbling about Eddie Mansfield, because he's the one who exposed the business on 2020 where he right there on 2020 where he took a razor blade and sliced his head open, told everyone it was a work, and just gave away all the behind the scenes secrets
Yeah.
of the business then. So I didn't want to get heat because I was young in the business, up at, just starting off wrestling. I was trying to earn a good spot with WCW. So Jack's like, why don't you just wrestle under a hood? They want to know who you are. I'm like, all right, cool. So that's where I met. That's where I met Kevin Kelly, and that's 30 some years ago. So, so I was actually really close. Blackjack Mulligan was one of my mentors, which what can you say? His son's Barry Windham, Kendall Windham.
Yeah, that's
His
amazing.
grand his son-in-law is Mike Rotunda IRS, and
Yeah.
Mike's sons were Bray
Bray
Wyatt
Wyatt,
and Bo Dallas and
Bo
everything.
Dallas.
So
And
there's a lot
any
of
WWF fan as I am know these names very well. So thank you for
yeah.
saying them for sure.
Oh yeah. So um but then I started, like I said, I was with WCW, like you were talking about. I was doing television matches, and then in 1991, I rode with a couple of my buddies that I started with. They were booked on a WWF to do TV, and it was a double shot, Pensacola, Florida, and Biloxi, Mississippi. So I rode up. I wasn't booked on it, but back in those days to get booked, and it's not like now where everything's readily available with social media and stuff like that. You had to constantly be on the telephone, you know, you know, networking, promoting yourself,
Yeah.
sending out VHSs, which a lot of people don't know who those are anymore.
No.
You had to send out promo shots, all that stuff, just to keep that ball rolling. So you're constantly, besides working hard in the ring and you getting in shape and all this stuff, you had to promote your own self to keep the bookings coming. So I went up there for the ride, and the first night they had nothing for me, because they already had everyone figured it and everything. The next night we're in Biloxi, Mississippi. They're like, "Hey, who can do the Legion of Doom's finish? Who can do the Legion of Doom's finish?" And I'm like, and this was Tony Garea, was the agent, and was saying that. And I'm like, I can do it. He's like, well, you're booked against the Legion of Doom. I said, well, I'm not even booked on the show. He's like, well, you are now. I'm like, okay. So when he walked away, I looked at my buddies. I said, hey, what's Legion of Doom's finish? I don't even know. And they're like, oh, I said, oh yeah, I can do it, no problem. So they were like, listen, animals, like, I'm gonna go under you like we're in a pool playing chicken. Put my head between your legs, and I'm gonna squeeze your calf. I'm gonna give you the Iggy, and when I do that, just do like a calf raise, like you're pushing up, and you'll pop right up on my shoulders, and Hawk will come off the top rope and give you the clothesline, and I'll push your legs up to cause you to flip, and you don't need to do anything. I'm like, okay. I always like to do a little bit extra, kind
Yeah.
of, for they would say, oh, look at that, that was cool, trying to set myself aside from everyone else, be a little different. So I actually pushed off um Joe's head, and I did one, two, and the third one halfway and landed on my belly.
Oh,
And it was over so big that that little spot was in the scissor reel leading up to SummerSlams and up to WrestleMania that year. So after that, I got booked all the time. And then if you keep on fast forward, and I wrestled for both the promotions back and forth. Um, but back to what you're saying, during the Monday Night Wars, when wrestling was at the biggest that we've seen probably ever, I was in WCW. And I'll give you an example. When they did Hall and Nash just jumped over from from WWF to WCW, and they had the tapings at MGM Studios, and they made a stadium outside. You could see all the palm trees in it, and it said MGM, and Hall and Nash were sitting up there. And you probably remember when Nash threw Rey Mysterio like a human lawn dart into that trailer in the
yeah.
back.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
actually standing right behind the camera when that happened. So at the same time, you had my co-host partner Kevin Kelly. He was in WWF as one of the announcers, and everyone knows him from there. But he had the Montreal Screwjob, talking about Canada again. He was up there, and Bret Hart was doing a documentary, Beyond the Mat, and Kevin Kelly was like the liaison from the WWF to their producers and helping them. So he was right behind that camera at the Montreal Screwjob when he was yelling at Vince McMahon and everything. So we have all those things, 30 years of wrestling, being in the wrestling business together, not necessarily always together, but our paths had always coincide. And so it leaves us to have unlimited content. We just turn on the camera and just start talking, and just
Yeah,
so that's how everything started. That's how my career went in. I was very fortunate to have a lot of mentors. Like I was saying, I got broken in by Bugsy McGraw. Blackjack Mulligan was another one. Another one was Kevin Sullivan. Kevin
oh yeah.
Sullivan was the booker, and I was a very close friend of his until he just passed, not too long ago. You know, you know, it's
Amazing
very
wrestling.
sad. He was a great guy. He helped me so much. He's probably one of the smartest guys in the business. I mean, his mind for the business was way. I mean, the guy could call heat. I mean, he was just great. And um, when we were doing TV, he was the booker. He was the boss. So he would tell um, Paul Orndorff, which was his assistant, hey, this is Casey. It's one of my boys. Take care of him. So Paul's like, hey, you're from Florida, and this is in like started off in '96 when the Olympic Summer Games were in Atlanta. So there's nothing going to be going on in Atlanta because the Olympic Games is there. They take up
Yeah,
half the state,
yeah, they
and
take
all the
everything.
production companies, the cameras, everything. So they ended up moving the whole entire outfit down to Florida to MGM. And they used MGM's cameras and production people and everything because of the Olympic Games. And so because of that, um,
I did not know.
I was able to, and I lived there locally. So Paul's like, hey, guys? I'm like, I know everyone. He's like, all right, we'll use you to bring all the guys. I'll tell you how many guys I need. Then I'll tell you what I'm looking for. And I'm like, you gotcha, no problem. So then I had Paul. Paul became real close friends, and he was really helping me. He would, tell me after every match what he didn't like or what he liked and didn't like and stuff like that. So I had a lot of mentors that helped
Mr.
me throughout
Wonderful.
the years, and I was fortunate enough to be able to wrestle so many legends that
Amazing.
a lot of them aren't even around anymore.
Well, now you're actually doing something just as amazing. You have your very own wrestling podcast with your friend of 30 years. Let's talk
Yeah,
about your wrestling podcast a little bit. I believe it's called In Ring. Am I right?
in ring wrestling podcast, and a little behind the scenes how that happened is uh the name. When you look at the format sheets and part of the podcast I do is I tell a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes. Um, well, let me get in. Well, I'll back up a little bit. I had an idea that I wanted to do a podcast, but as everyone knows, the wrestling podcast market is very oversaturated.
Yeah.
It's one of the most saturated, podcasting markets is professional wrestling. But I thought I had something a little unique that was a niche product because um, you have what I wanted to do is I wanted everyone has their own perspective on the business and wrestling. So I wanted to give my perspective as a television wrestler. They call them jobbers, enhancement guys, extras, whatever it might be. We're just wrestlers, is what we are. But I wanted to give my perspective from my time there to everyone else. So, but so you take say someone like Lex Luger and Rick Steiner. Well, Lex Luger might treat Rick one way, but he might treat me a different way because I'm not the top guy like Rick was.
Mhm.
So I called Kevin and I'm like, hey, listen, I have this ideal for a podcast. I just want your thoughts on it because, like I said, we've been friends for 30 years, and I even after I stopped wrestling, I ran my own promotion, and Kevin came down was one of my commentators. I had TV for a couple of years and stuff like that. So, um, yeah, I knew that he thinks like I think, and I could bounce an ideal off of him. He would tell me, yeah, it's good or no. No, I wouldn't touch it. Stuff like that. He's honest with me. He's not going to just be a yes man.
Yeah.
So I said, listen, this is what I want to do, and he's like, okay. And I said, so what I'm looking for is I'm looking for maybe like a young guy that wants to get in the business as a commentator and, can help be a co-host to help keep the show flowing because, I need someone to keep the momentum going in the show and the flow and keep it the way it needs to be and everything. He's all right, let me think about it and I'll make some calls and, we'll get back together. I'm like, okay. So I called him a couple weeks later and he's like, you know what? I've been talking to a few of my friends and they all love the concept. And he says, and so do I. And he says, and if you're looking for someone, I would love to do it. I'd love to be your co-host. I'm like, really? He's like, if you have me, I said, absolutely. Kevin's great, so that's how we started. But then where the name came from, when you look at the format sheets to doing TV, it'll have all these time codes and everything, and then it will say M and E, music and entrance, and then have a time code there. So you have, say, Sting, and it will say verse, and it will say in ring, and a big
Oh, interesting.
dash, and they
Very
write someone's
interesting.
name in, like Casey Thompson. So as the TV guy, you didn't get a music and entrance. You were already in ring. So that's where the name came from. When the other guy was leaving, yourself and the referee would walk out to the ring, and that we would be in there. And because they want to keep the flow of the show going, the time and everything. So they're
Yeah.
not going to give everyone a music and entrance back then because they were doing so many matches, just pumping
So
them
you
out like
would just
crazy.
start in the ring and then the main attraction would come in with music.
Right. So we were in ring. So that's where the name came from, in ring wrestling podcast. So, but in the podcast, we like to do a lot of behind the scenes things that we talk about stuff from behind the scenes because I'm a real big believer in that everyone wants to see what they can't have, or they want, when you go to a concert, everyone wants to be backstage, have a backstage pass where they can see what's behind the curtain, things like that. So, you look at Howard Stern, right? He'd go talking and they would start coming arguing and stuff, and he'd be yelling at them and saying, no one wants to hear about what's going on back here. Yes, you do. That's what everyone wanted to hear. So that's what I do is I will, all right, so we talked, let me give you some examples. We talked about the gorilla position, how it evolved over the years, how when I was in WWF, it would be a table, a monitor, and a headset with Gorilla Monsoon telling you, go to the ring, and how it evolved now into a whole production center. They have so much stuff up there. We talk about when Kevin was behind the scenes doing interviews with The Rock or Stone Cold and stuff like that. Things that people want to know that they not sure about, but you have people that I was there as a wrestler. He was in the other organization as a commentator or a backstage interviewer, and and did a lot. He worked for the magazine there. He did a lot of different, filled it off a lot of roles. So we bring that all together and give it to everyone every week when we do our recordings and everything. So
That's
it,
very
it it
interesting.
came out pretty good.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, this is a part that I'd like to find out where your social media outlets are. So anyone who does watch us here today can find your work.
Sure. Sure. So everything is in ring wrestling podcast. You can see our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everything in ring wrestling podcast, everything social media from Facebook to Instagram to TikTok to X. It's all the same in ring wrestling podcast.
Thank
So
you.
we try to put content out all the time and interact with all the listeners and everything.
That's great. I appreciate that. No, this is the end of what our day here today, unfortunately, Casey. But I'm going to leave the final word to you. That anything you would like to add to our listeners here today.
Well, I'd like to just thank you, Ken, for having me on the show, letting me tell a little bit about my story, what brought me into wrestling, what you know my wrestling brought me into becoming a podcaster. So and let me come on here and talking about my podcast and with Kevin Kelly. We're excited that we're building it from the grassroots, from the bottom up. We know it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Mhm.
And so we put the time in, we put the effort in, and that's why we're out here constantly just plugging it and just telling our message. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on here to share my message with all of your listeners. And hopefully you can have me on another time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I really loved your stories, and I would love to hear a million more. It's very exciting, the world of wrestling, and just like yourself, I have enjoyed it my whole life as well. So I'm very excited to be back on here today. I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time.
Oh, no
So
problem.
my name is Ken Judge, and we're here today on Ken's Corner podcast with Casey Thompson, former professional wrestler and host of In-Ring Wrestling Podcast. Thank you so much, Casey.
Thank you. Enjoy that nice weather up there in Canada.
I'll try. I'll try before it hits down to zero.
Yeah, exactly.
Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.